You know, it's really funny to see the internet collectively do a 180 on a game in real time, especially when it seems that their opinions completely change overnight. I think there's no other better example than the recent case with Quake 2 and its remaster. Coming out of complete nowhere, Quake 2 Enhanced Edition has brought a lot of attention to this seemingly once mighty giant of late 90s FPS titles. Most of it positive. I think it's safe for me to say that Quake 2 had always been kind of the black sheep of the OG id games. In some ways, it was the last of their single-player arena titles, before they moved on entirely to either multiplayer ventures or experimental stuff like Doom 3. The feelings gamers had to Quake 2 when it launched was positive, don't get me wrong, but as time went on, and as it became more of a brand than a group of well-known developers, feelings towards this game, best as I can tell, was usually one of apathy, and perhaps even a bit of disdain. Especially from people who loved Quake 1, considering Quake 2 had little to do with the game it was supposedly a sequel to, with a completely different setting, a different story, and no connection to the Lovecraftian gothic shooter that was its predecessor. Instead, being set in a hard sci-fi war on an alien planet full of murderous, evil cyborgs. And I have to fully admit, I was kind of in this line of thinking as well. I really like Quake 1, but I never really liked Quake 2. I never hated it. In fact, I enjoyed parts of it, but it just never stuck around in my brain. It was just kind of overshadowed by my love for Doom or Quake 1. A couple years ago, Quake 1 was remastered as well, and I guess it was only a matter of time before id and Bethesda got around to Quake 2. And after having played it extensively, I can safely say that I thoroughly love Quake 2. By far one of the best games I sadly slept on, and I know the same goes for a lot of people too. I wouldn't call it a perfect remaster, but I still very much enjoyed it, and I appreciate some of the new inclusions. All I can say is that it was so good that it made me revisit the original. Thanks to Quake 2 Enhanced Edition, I've now played through the game multiple times in the span of a few weeks. So what about Quake 2 holds up after all these years later? Why is this game, among all of id's classics, still so fun to play? And how is this game that was once a despised sequel managing to worm its way in people's all-time favorites lists, myself included? I've really been loving Quake 2. I appreciate the Enhanced Edition because it gave me a good excuse to revisit it. I've played through the remaster, which I enjoyed enough just to get me to replay the original version as well, just so I could compare the two, as well as, you know, you guessed it, have an excuse to play more Quake 2. Having had a lot of time to play through the game and appreciate its details, I keep gaining more and more love for it. I genuinely love Quake 2. I love its combat, its level design, its enemies, its world, to the point where, I hate to say it, I think I may like it more than Quake 1. Only time will tell, of course, but the remaster genuinely is going to open a lot of people's eyes to this 90s classic. And it's not hard to see why. Quake 2 was always the middle child of id Software, sandwiched right between their innovative classics and their rougher period following it. It's funny to even call it a rough period. I'll go on record to say that none of id Software's games are even remotely bad, maybe average at worst, but when you compare it to their best titles, average pretty much seems to be a complete failure. And that's sort of what happened to id after their glory days of Doom and Quake. It was also around the time of Quake 2 where the studio started to change. There were internal power struggles, disagreements, and clashing visions. After Quake 1, you lost a ton of massive figures. Like John Romero would leave the studio, a year later American McGee would be let go from the company. After Quake 2, it would make Quake 3, a multiplayer-only shooter, albeit with a robust 3D engine. And even following that, Quake would get a sequel, Quake 4, with a very unusual team-focused gameplay and dark, spooky lighting that was ripped directly from Doom 3. And ultimately, you had spin-offs like Enemy Territory Quake Wars, and even the more recent Quake Champions, and they all turned Quake into just an identity-lacking brand. It was essentially just a logo that you put on the box. Just a hodgepodge of genres and ideas with no connection. And Quake 2 was definitely the start of that. But now, having given it the time it deserved, I see Quake 2 in a brand new light, and I appreciate it more than I ever thought I would. So much so that, yeah, it's kind of a new all-time favorite. I think what helped was the fact that I was finally able to see it disconnected from the rest of the Quake series. And it changed my opinion. So why is that? How can a 25-year-old game recapture my enjoyment? Well, it's all mostly thanks to its design, its combat, its levels, and the extra finishing touches that make it a masterpiece. No id Software game has legs unless it has solid action. And Quake 2 definitely has some of their best. Its combat feels very different from Quake 1, although I feel it's a pretty great improvement in many ways. If I could summarize Quake 2, is that it has Quake 1's polish with Doom's variety. Quake 1 had an insane amount of polish for a game of its era, but it was super heavily streamlined. Less enemies, less weapons, less fluff. Doom, meanwhile, had a ton of meat, large levels, lots of weapons and enemies. Except it was very clear that id was experimenting with their tech. So a lot of it feels like the developers were figuring it out as they made the game. Because the developers were figuring this stuff out as they made the game. So you go back and play original Doom, it feels clunky in a lot of areas, and it's definitely a hard game to get into all these years later. So here comes Quake 2, which now has just as much polish as Quake 1, probably even more in some aspects, except it's trying to capture Doom's variety, mainly in guns and enemies. Where Quake 1 was pretty Spartan in its design, Quake 2 now has some meat on its bones. With Quake 1, enemies were major bullet sponges. Half the time it felt like you were hacking away at a tree stump. There were fewer enemies also. Rarely you'd fight more than a few guys at the same time, and this was mostly due to technical limitations. For Quake 2, it feels like id went out of their way to recapture that great combat from Doom, and to try and mesh it into Quake 1's slick gameplay. Now there's more enemies, a bigger variety of enemies too, more weapons than Quake 1. It's also very polished too, where all the weapons, power-ups, and enemies seem to mesh perfectly together. You don't have those frustrating moments you'd have in classic id games. Here, Quake 2 feels much more balanced, and as a result, much more engaging. I also need to talk about weapon variety, because it's one of those games where I think id got the closest to having the perfect weapon roster. For a lot of reasons too. First thing I noticed when playing it again was that every gun had a specific role, and a purpose that made it unique to each and every other gun. Okay, yeah, the super shotgun still reigns supreme, although it's got a wider spread and the regular shotgun is a bit more accurate. But the rest of the guns, they all fit a particular niche. For example, machine gun and chain gun. They use the same ammo pool, they're both an automatic weapon. You'd think the chain gun would make the machine gun completely redundant, like in any other game, maybe even Quake 1, but not in Quake 2. Here, the chain gun obviously does more damage, because it fires faster. Insanely fast. Fast to the point where you can use up all of your ammo in a few seconds. And there's also a wind-up mechanic, where you have to slowly spool your Gatling gun until it's finally up to speed. And this is such a big delay that you can be killed if you don't time it right with an enemy encounter. But once it's full auto, that thing is fast and does insane damage. And as I said, it chews through all of your ammo completely. You're supposed to treat it like a power weapon. On the other hand, you got the regular machine gun, which, sure, does way less damage, but it's slower firing and it has no windup. So it's more reliable, more efficient on ammo, and you don't have to worry about timing it with enemy encounters. With just a couple little tweaks, it made these two guns serve their own different roles, meaning that you'll constantly be switching back and forth between the two. And a lot of the guns, save for the pistol, all have these little aspects and tweaks to them that make them fun and unique to handle, especially in comparison to each other, which is why that even though the super shotgun is the go-to jack of all trades, you'll still be switching out to other guns in a firefight. Even something like the hyper blaster doesn't replace the machine gun or the chain gun. Like the chain gun, it has a delayed wind-up time, and even though it's more ammo efficient, it has slow-moving projectiles that enemies can dodge. Its ammo pool is also connected to the BFG 10,000's ammo, as well as the energy armor, so the game once again incentivizes you to not entirely rely on it. I feel the weapon lineup here is a very good blend with Quake 1 and classic Doom. The brand new gun here though is the railgun, which would go on to be a staple of the Quake series, especially in multiplayer. It's a very welcomed inclusion that makes the weapon roster feel complete, and I found myself probably using it the most alongside my super shotgun through the campaign, if only just because of how fun it is. That doesn't even compare to how it handles in multiplayer, which is another story. There's a reason why this weapon roster, for the most part, has become pretty consistent for id Software since this game's release. Because in just about every game following it, even up to the Doom reboots, you can see each of these guns make a return in some form or another. It's just a good combination, and the combat feels great because of it. Making their debut appearance in Quake 2 is the Strog. Strog. I've pronounced it as Strog my entire life. I think it's meant to be Strogue. Anyway, they're cybernetic aliens who attacked and decimated Earth, and now humanity is finally getting their retribution by attacking their home planet. It's a departure from the supernatural of its previous games, and places Quake 2 firmly in grungy, dark sci-fi. And I'll be honest, I think the Strog have grown on me. For starters, you can see a lot of Doom in the enemy lineup. Quake 1 had very limited enemy numbers, with barely a few at a time thrown at you, and even then they were mostly bullet sponges. Here, Quake 2 has a lot lower health enemies in larger numbers. From basic troops, flying drones, they're nice cannon fodder enemies to fight large groups of. In this regard, it reminds me a lot of Doom. There's a few enemies that do feel inspired by Quake 1, albeit modified to feel a bit more fun to fight and interact with. More attack patterns, very good AI. I never had a shambler moment like in Quake, where an enemy is just super annoying to deal with. Here, all the bad guys feel fair and balanced. Enemies have telegraphed attacks, so if you pay attention to their cues, you can easily avoid damage. Again, it just feels good to play. One thing I love is the little details in how enemies behave. For example, some of them will duck out of the way from rockets or hyper blaster shots. They can be knocked down and stunned. Even killing them can treat you to some great death animations, like how the guards will fall down and somewhat crawl before they bleed out, or even shoot at you on the ground as a last stand. My favorite death animation has to be with the enforcers, where if you shoot off their head, they'll still fire off a chain gun round that can actually do damage before they fall to the ground. This is great stuff. This is what I meant when I said that Quake 2 has Quake 1's polish, but Doom's variety. It has so much fluff and so many details to the gameplay, yet it still feels smooth and timeless to play despite its age, which is a real accomplishment. I should also mention how the remaster makes some small changes to the enemy AI. The most obvious one is with the Berserker, who now has a leap attack which can knock back the player if they're super close. He also seems to be able to jump up and down platforms easily to reach you. The Super Shotgun is also more deadly against him, with close range shots being able to knock him down, which after playing the original version, I don't think happens at all. I'm not sure about any other changes to the other enemies, but it wouldn't surprise me if a few of them have slight alterations. Quake 2 was also important for adding an inventory, which stores items and power-ups that you can use and activate whenever you want. This definitely feels like id borrowing from other FPS games, but it's a welcome inclusion. And if anything, it adds an extra layer to ammo management. In Quake 1, you pick up quad damage, and you have to use that power-up as fast as you can before it runs out, which, incidentally, can result in you picking it up at the wrong time and wasting it. Quake 2's approach is different, where you can stock up on a handful of power-ups and items, and save them for a rainy day. You can store up to 2 quad damages, and like every other power weapon, it becomes a matter of knowing when to use it. Save it for a boss, or use it on a massive swarm of enemies, or just save it until you reach a level that properly needs it. I know some people prefer the classic way of handling power-ups, I get it, but I found this mechanic to be really refreshing, and it just adds another layer to the combat, knowing that if your weapons fail, you have a handful of other alternatives in your back pocket. The remaster now added in a weapon wheel and an item wheel, which I do appreciate. It's now faster to switch between weapons in Quake 2, and being able to use items is a lot easier. I know some people dislike weapon wheels, I don't mind. I get people like using their number hotkeys, but I'll be honest guys, it's kinda hard to reach all the way over to your railgun and BFG in a battle. Sometimes it's easier just to have a weapon wheel. Although in the remaster, there's a weird item here that is completely brand new. The compass. Which, yeah, I'm not a big fan of this. But to talk about that, we have to talk about Quake 2's level design. If there's one thing that truly holds up the most about Quake 2, it's the level design. When I first played Quake 2, I was kind of confused by the levels. I saw there was a bit of backtracking, multiple loading screens per mission, a good amount of key hunting and secrets. It felt very different from Quake 1, and especially Doom, in that multiple arenas were separated from each other, hidden between load screens, as opposed to every individual level from Quake and Doom essentially being its own isolated arena. I never really thought much of it. However, having had a chance to revisit it, wow, the level design is really a shock to play with a fresh mind. It is in-depth, lots of interconnected rooms and levels, puzzles that require you to progress into one area, then back into another, almost in a mini pseudo-hub world. Yet despite how complex this could end up being, it's all very streamlined and easy to navigate. I think to see how revolutionary Quake 2's levels really are, you kinda have to look back at id's previous games, specifically Doom 1, Doom 2, and Quake 1. Now I love Doom. As far as I'm concerned, it might be the single most influential FPS game ever made. It's a classic, there's no arguing that. But it's a classic because it's old. It's dated in a lot of respects. Not to say that's a bad thing. However, it does make it hard to approach. And one of the biggest filters from OG Doom 1 and 2 has to be its approach to levels. Because Doom is a maze, a labyrinth if you will. The levels all devolve into complex mazes where half the time you don't even know where you're going or what you're looking for. Maybe you're looking for a key. Maybe you're looking for a lever that will open up a random wall or door. Who knows? Doom is really fun, intense action, separated by long, tedious backtracking and puzzle solving. It's a good example of classic 90s gaming. Maze-like and cryptic. It was id figuring out how their engine worked, and as a result the levels are complicated, they're experimental, and downright confusing in parts. And it's the hardest part about picking it up and playing it 30 years later. Quake 1 is where things changed, and I think for the better. Quake's levels were a breath of fresh air. because they were beautifully streamlined without losing their complexities or challenge. Now all of a sudden, levels weren't sprawling mazes. Instead, they were these beautiful, simple arenas with multiple pathways that looped around effortlessly and focused players into a single route, letting them navigate a large explorable space without getting lost. Very rarely is the player backtracking out of confusion. Instead, the game keeps pace, funneling them into arenas full of enemies, letting the player know that they're on the right path, as well as ensuring that there are none of those classic Doom moments, boring wandering through an empty level with a bunch of already dead demons. Quake 1 is a fucking miracle of level design. It was a great way for it to flex their muscles, and in regard to the levels and maps, I think it's some of their best work. The levels were a bit smaller though, claustrophobic in parts and very tightly packed. So with Quake 2, it feels like id were trying their hardest to perfect this particular style of level design, taking Quake 1's streamlined approach to maps, but upping the pace and making the environments far more sprawling and expansive. The best way I can describe this is that they took heavily streamlined arenas, think Quake 1 but shrunk down to bite-sized levels, and then interconnected those mini levels together to create individual missions. Missions that would then have you entering pseudo-hub arenas, branching off into separate levels before returning and going into another one. And on paper, this sounds like it could be a fucking mess. This could easily lead into some hellish, confusing mazes that any seasoned Doom vet could easily get lost in. But instead, the levels here are expertly crafted, just to keep players focused and knowing exactly where they have to go. It's not a corridor shooter. It still has the complexities of a Doom level. However, using things like landmarks, easy to identify pathways, and essentially keeping the player moving forward. It is a very shockingly intuitive game to play. Even 25 years later, you're always moving on track, pathways will open up, enemies spawn in, signaling that you're headed the right way. But likewise, there's plenty of exploration you can do. You can backtrack, you can look for secrets, hidden levels. As far as I'm concerned, it found the perfect blend of levels that let you explore and hunt for secrets, while also keeping you on the right path and making sure you don't get lost. You're able to explore this game for fun, not because you have to. The secret missions are fun too. I love the satellite one, where it's all low gravity and you can do some insane rocket jumps to get up to ledges and platforms. I actually found myself doing a lot more secret hunting in this game than in any other id game. More than Quake 1 and especially more than Doom. Simply because I think in those games, I'd usually end up lost or confused if I strayed from where I was supposed to go. But in Quake 2, levels are easy to read and learn. Genuinely, up until the Palace level, which is like the second to last mission of the game, I had not gotten lost in Quake 2's levels once. I had pretty much known in the back of my head where I kind of need to go. I think the level design is utterly fantastic. From start to finish, Quake 2 shows a level of polish that is unmatched. It's honestly hard to put into words how well these levels flow into one another. You really never feel lost. You always feel focused on where you're going. And they had the benefit of not losing their complexity. I have a hot take. I think this actually might be its best level design for any game. On the topic of getting lost, I should also mention what the remaster adds. Quake 2 Enhanced Edition has an inclusion that is definitely controversial, to say the least. It has a compass. This is a waypoint system, or maybe more like that Dead Space Pathfinder mechanic that tells you exactly where to go. This, I'm really not sure about. I totally get why they'd add something like this. With the announced Enhanced Edition, you probably know that a lot of people are going to try out Quake 2 for the first time, and they're probably going to be completely out of their depth, since Quake 2 is an authentic, hard arena shooter, little different from those modern indie throwback FPS games that a lot of people are used to playing. So to make a smooth transition, this was clearly added to help dummies who can't figure out their way around a level without constant waypoints and objective markers. Which, ironically, Quake 2 was already innovative for adding objectives in an FPS game when it released. Quake 2 is the last id game that needs a waypoint system. Its levels are so streamlined that I can't really understand who'd need it, outside of someone who is so incompetent with games that they need to be handheld 24/7. So like journalists and then maybe Darkside Phil. Maybe. I get it's an optional feature, but it being there is genuinely teasing. And it's a shame because it'll just encourage people to follow a meaningless dotted line as opposed to learning the level and taking in the environment. I feel like it also discourages exploration too. I think Quake 2's best feature is that its levels had the right blend of being easy to navigate, but also being chock full of hidden secrets. With this compass, the player can just ignore all that effort and make a beeline to the end. So, it is what it is. Speaking of the Enhanced Edition, we have to talk about the visuals, but I first want to point out how the original still holds up visually well. Quake 2, even over 25 years later, is still a very striking game to look at, both in terms of its graphics and its environments. I'll just flat out say it, guys, I love how Quake 2 looks. I love this graphic style that you see in a lot of 90s 3D games, but Quake 2 especially looks really nice. This is probably going to be hard to convey towards people who don't play a lot of older games and who look at this and think that it's just a bunch of low poly blocks and models, so it's definitely subjective. But come on, Quake 2 looks so charming, especially for its age. It's nailed by a ton of little artistic choices too, mainly in color and lighting. Every room you walk through, they have a variety of these color and light choices. A mix of dark shadows with lit up areas. Even the colors, usually sticking to a faded orange, but occasionally showing off deep reds and blues. I think there's just a tasteful use of colors and lighting. Rooms don't look flat or boring, they all have a nice little touch to them. Every single environment has a lot of life to it, even if it is technically just a generic tech corridor. It's got a clever use of geometry, well-placed light sources, it all looks great. Again, if you're weird like me, you'll enjoy this game's graphics. It's easy to forget just how innovative Quake 2 was. One of the big inclusions was dynamic lighting, which was insane at the time. In fact, I think a lot of weapons are even designed around this new feature. Things like your pistol and the hyper blaster now fire lit up projectiles, which can actually light up dark corridors. It's gimmicky, but it's still pretty fun to see. What's funny is stuff like this has only ended up aging shockingly well, since nowadays we have an explosion of games emulating 90s graphics. So I think stuff like levels as well as models and weapons and enemies, they all still look nice thanks to this pretty timeless art style. I also still love how the Strogg look. Each one looks unique and has such a weird design. They're all interesting to look at. One thing that could be a negative to some people is that every level does sort of blend together. They're all set in an orange sci-fi city with maybe some unique set pieces to set them apart. Literally, my favorite level was the space station, mostly because it had a different skybox and it had a completely different feel to it. And if I had a criticism, I think Quake 2 could have used more of this. The remaster does try to remedy this by using a somewhat invasive colored fog in each level to try and look different, but now we've just looped back around to an unappealing art style, since I'm not really a fan of this look. Like, I think Quake 2's OG graphics look perfectly fine as they were. They didn't need this change. Okay, so I kinda have to complain about the remaster. I wish I could disable the new dynamic lighting shader. Don't get me wrong, sometimes it looks pretty good. A few levels even have a completely new atmosphere thanks to it. For example, the bunker level looks a lot nicer, since in the original, it used a repeated wall texture way too much. So the entire room looked very bland and flat. But with the remaster, this lighting actually makes it look really nice. The factory looks fucking awesome now, with the red hot magma giving off a stronger glow. I still enjoyed how this looked in the original, just that the remaster gives it a nice atmosphere that fits pretty well. But then you run into levels that completely change the atmosphere, with an oddly colored fog that is very different from the original. Some areas clash a bit, with the new lighting not quite fitting in with the old graphics, and some levels look straight up unfinished, like the boss arena in the prison. In the original, it has a nice dark lighting to it, with some blue light sources giving it some depth. In the remaster, there's no blue lighting at all, and there's just this flat, bright light covering the entire room. No shadows, no shading, just looks very flat and unfinished. Just a bit ugly to me. Even some of the outdoor areas, like, yeah, I don't mind how this looks in the remaster. I feel they may have lost a bit of that charm. OG Quake 2 was very dark and grungy. Outdoors with the orange sky, it felt like very late evening or early dusk. But then you go to Quake 2 Enhanced Edition, and now all of a sudden everything's bright and sunny. I get some people would prefer this to the dark lighting of the original, but I mean, come on, can we at least have a compromise? Can we make this a toggle or something? I guess ultimately, any criticism I make can be countered with the fact that I can still just play the original. And this remaster didn't cost me anything. Also, another thing is that the remastered version slightly updates the models for enemies and weapons. And yeah, it's a pretty solid inclusion. Although it's such a minor change that I'd kind of prefer if they just didn't mess with the visuals at all. Again, I know it's for people who like updating older games, but I'm just a purist, so it's not meant for me. But yeah, OG Quake 2, it still holds up as far as I'm concerned. And I'm happy that I decided to revisit the original. I find it fascinating just how much influence Quake 2 seems to have on the FPS genre that not enough people acknowledge. It was insanely innovative when it came out, with a ton of scripting, interconnected design. Even the structure of the game gave more story to the campaign, and thanks to the previously mentioned level design, it felt like an actual journey from start to finish through the Strogg home planet, as opposed to a series of disconnected arenas like a lot of other games. Even the planet of Stroggos itself is probably one of the most fleshed out worlds it had ever made at the time, especially to their games prior. Sure, stylistically, it's just a barren planet with corridors, caves, and sci-fi tech. However, there's a sense of groundedness to all of it. This isn't a series of abstract blocks and polygons. These are rooms and buildings that all serve a purpose. There are prison cells, smelting plants, warehouses, hangar bays, laboratories, palaces. Basic now? Sure, but for id in 1997, this was an insane change of pace. When you played Doom, you could barely comprehend what you were even walking through. Like, yeah, it's based on Phobos, but what the hell is this stuff? What are these rooms? It all has a surrealness to it. Even Quake 1 has a ton of weirdness. Like, sure, some sci-fi corridors, but then you enter eldritch dimensions ripped straight out of a fantasy dungeon. Who even knows what plane of reality you're on anymore? Nothing matters. Quake 2 was a completely different beast compared to its early stuff, so it's no wonder why tons of games borrowed from it. Okay, this is a bit of a tangent. I've never seen this stuff addressed or acknowledged, best I can tell, but there are so many inspirations from Quake 2 that resurface in other game series, mainly other FPSs. Once you start noticing them, you'll kinda go crazy, but they're there, and they become hard to ignore. A lot of stylistic inspiration too. It could be a coincidence, who knows? Although the one game that I can't ignore when talking about Quake 2 is Half-Life. Yeah, any 90s FPS fan can easily see the similarities between both titles, mainly in the heavy focus on story and levels that flow into each other. These are levels that have multiple stages within each other that allow for backtracking, which requires players to go through loading screens. Half-Life's level design is eerily similar, and it's something I noticed as far back as when I first tried Quake 2 as a kid. Half-Life famously had a long and storied development. Its engine, Gold Source, was a modified Quake 1 engine, and the game was even supposed to come out the same year as Quake 2, in '97. But with Valve being Valve, they pushed it to 1998. On one hand, sure, maybe the game had no inspiration whatsoever from Quake 2. Maybe Valve were doing their own thing since the release of Quake 1, trying to get their debut game off the ground, not having time to worry about any other competitors. That could easily be the case. However, on the flip side, maybe during Half-Life's long development, they did take inspiration from Quake 2. Doom 1 is cited as the big inspiration to Half-Life, so it's possible that Valve borrowed more from its other games. That's just something I've always wondered about. Maybe it was convergent game design. Maybe other people noticed it too and I'm not crazy. I don't know. And revisiting it, yeah, I'm shocked at how many little bits of influence Quake 2 has with other FPS games. I'd also be remiss to not talk about some of the good, welcome inclusions to the Enhanced Edition, mainly being the brand new levels, the Quake 64 campaign, as well as working multiplayer and co-op. Machine Games added in a big new campaign, which I sadly haven't had time to fully play through, and even then what I did play was mostly through co-op. What I played felt kind of alright, if a little too complex for Quake 2. I think a lot of these areas might work better for maybe Quake 1, but that's just me. The stuff that I really loved, however, was how easy it was to set up multiplayer, which gave me my first taste of Quake 2's deathmatch, including all of its original maps, and even some of the expansion maps too. It played really well. I really love how the combat feels, and after hearing about it for years, I can confirm that the multiplayer for Quake 2 is fucking awesome. It's fast and fluid, just like the single player. The weapons, minus the starting pistol, all feel great to use, even if the expansion content can be a little unbalanced. I'll even go so far as to say that all the original Quake 2 maps feel great to play on. They have a good flow to them, with lots of verticality and interactive set pieces. Hell, I think some of these maps outpace even Quake 3's multiplayer maps. Ultimately though, I think what really helped was being able to play it with a small group of friends, which highlighted what old multiplayer games used to be all about. Not about XP or progression or unlocks or skins or battle passes, but just friends sitting around yelling and laughing at each other. And getting to experience that in a game such as Quake 2 was such a blast. I think that's what I ultimately appreciate about this and Quake 1's remaster, is just how easy it is for new players to jump into these games. For us, we were able to get a multiplayer lobby set up in seconds. As for the co-op, well, it is what it is. I always thought it was an odd inclusion since games like Quake and Quake 2 aren't the best to play cooperatively. Cramped hallways, backtracking, enemies balanced around a single person, so I see it more as just a funny gimmick. I will say though, co-op was shockingly fun on Quake 2 64's campaign. I never even heard of Quake 2 on the N64, so it was kind of a fun first playthrough for me and my friends. It was a short game that was notoriously hard. It's a bite-sized campaign with a ton of tough enemies packed into tight linear levels, and I find that campaign was pretty ideal for co-op. Just a fun, chill experience playing Quake 2 with some pals. I think what makes this all the more insane is that Quake 2 Enhanced Edition has so much content, so many behind the scenes bonus features and extras, yet it's completely free to anyone who already owned the game. That's right, 100% free, at least for people who owned Quake 2 on Steam or GOG. Even now, after the remaster, it's still only $10 for such a good package. It's hilarious because any other game studio would simply bundle this up and release it for full price. Yet both this and Quake 1 were fully remastered, given extra campaigns and additional content just as a free update to people who already own it. And they can still play the originals alongside it. It's kind of incredible. I am very critical towards companies like Bethesda, but you know what? Even I'll admit it. This was a home run. This was a solid effort all around, and I give 2 thumbs up to Night Dive and Machine Games for this amazing remaster. And if nothing else, this enhanced version of Quake 2 has brought way more eyes back to it. Like I said earlier, people seem to have taken a complete 180, and now I think Quake 2 has gained a whole new audience that might not have given it a chance years ago. A part of me genuinely wonders how well remembered Quake 2 could have been had it not been called, Quake 2. If it had instead gone with their other proposed titles, like Strog or Lock and Load. I think the fear at the time was that Quake was a hot commodity, so the simple title of Quake 2 would sell any game attached to it, more so than any game called Strog. But I don't know. When this game came out, id were in their prime. Any game they would make would become an instant hit. Hell, look at all their prior games before that. Maybe Quake would have remained a single-player gothic FPS, and its spiritual successor, Strog, or whatever they would have called it, might have had its own run of sci-fi sequels and spin-offs. Maybe 1997's Strog would have been looked back at as favorably as Quake. I love to imagine the alternate universe in which id weren't defined by just 3 of their FPS titles, but by 4 of them. Hitler, Hell, Lovecraft, and alien cyborgs. A pretty solid combination, and it might give a new meaning to the phrase quad damage. Who's to say? Maybe this was the plan all along. What's done is done. And now we have an interesting, albeit chaotic franchise named Quake, and many, many unique and weird titles under its umbrella. Quake 2 essentially being the direct cause of all of it. But even if it's taken many years for the internet to drop its old grudge, it's nice to see a positive reception to a game that had only really received apathy for its shelf life. And now it's finally getting plenty of love, deservedly so. It's a genuinely well-made shooter, possibly old id Software's best. I'm not exaggerating, it's up there, with an extreme level of polish that remains unmatched among any other arena shooter, even to this day. I think Quake 2 is the definitive arena shooter of its time, that not a lot of people give it credit for. Quake 2 is the culmination of id honing their skills and making the best FPS they could. And over 25 years later, it's still timeless, more than any of their titles. So if you haven't played Quake 2 already, go play it. Go try out one of the best FPS games ever made. I still recommend the original version for people who want that added layer of authenticity with its wonderfully dark atmosphere, although getting it set up is a pain in the ass, especially getting music working, which is its own set of problems to deal with. Otherwise, the enhanced edition is pretty good. Just $10, no setup required, plus all that additional content and more. I mean, yeah, I get why people are going for it. Even if I still love the original, I'm pretty happy they remastered this game, because it finally forced me to give this game a chance. And I'm really happy that I did. I genuinely think Quake 2 surpasses Quake 1. And even Doom. I think I may have a new favorite 90s shooter. Only time will tell. But yeah, kind of a spur of the moment video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Check out Quake 2 if you want to. I recommend it. Another retrospective will hopefully be out soon. This time, right in the middle of spooky Halloween month. Otherwise, you guys take care. I'll see you next time.